The sand moved the way sand always moves when something large is watching it. Stella noticed it first in the way she noticed most things. Not with her eyes, but with the back of her neck. A tightening. The particular silence of a desert that has decided to hold its breath. She'd been walking for 6 hours by then, maybe 7, the sun hammering the top of her head through a hat that had stopped doing its job around hour 3. The canteen was a quarter full. She rationed the sips the way her father had taught her to ration everything, by reminding herself she'd been worse off before, which was mostly true. The drop pod had come down 12 kilometers northeast of the rendezvous point. She knew this because Ben had told her, and Ben was still at the rendezvous point because Ben had not been in the drop pod when the Keth hit the relay ship and sent everything sideways. She had the coordinates loaded into the wrist unit. She had 2 days of rations reduced to 7 hours of food and 1/4 canteen. She had the sidearm with 11 rounds. She had the small folded photograph she always carried in the left breast pocket, crinkled now with old sweat, the one she hadn't looked at in months, because looking at it was the kind of thing she saved for when she needed it. She hadn't needed it yet. That was the measure of how she was doing. The thing she felt watching her had not made itself visible. That was the other measure. The Keth did not hide. That was what the briefings said. And briefings were usually wrong about the things that would kill you. But this one had proven itself across 3 years of contact. The Keth did not hide, because hiding implied fear, and the Keth had encountered nothing in 30,000 years of expansion that had given them occasion to learn fear. They moved through territory the way weather moved, openly as a fact of the universe. When they came into your position, they came into it like a storm came in, visible from a long way off, preceded by the smell of ozone and the low harmonic frequency that made the fillings in your back teeth ring. So what she felt was probably nothing. Probably the desert. Probably exhaustion playing tricks on a brain that had been running hot since the relay hit. She kept walking. The coordinates said 4.3 kilometers. The sun said 2 hours before it dropped below the ridge to the west, and left her in darkness without a working heat tent. The math was the math. She had been an engineer before the Keth arrived. That was a lifetime ago. Not in years, 7 years, but in the way that counted. She'd been in the middle of a survey contract on Meridian, measuring soil composition and isotope ratios for a mineral extraction proposal, when the first contact burst came through on the emergency channel. She remembered exactly where she was when she heard it. Standing on a flat rock shelf above a dry riverbed, the scanner in her right hand returning normal readings, the sun doing the same thing suns did everywhere. Then the emergency burst. Then a silence in the comms that lasted 11 minutes, which was how long it took for the follow-up burst, the one that explained what the first burst had detected. She had stood on that rock shelf and looked at the scanner in her hand and thought, well, then she'd walked back to the crawler and driven to the nearest settlement and signed up. That was the thing about humans, Ben had said once, early on, before he'd learned to stop trying to articulate it. They hear about the end of the world and they sign up. He'd said it like it was strange. She'd never been able to explain why it wasn't. The sand moved again. Definitely moved. A ripple, 20 meters to her left, the way sand moved when something passed below its surface. She stopped, drew the sidearm. 11 rounds against whatever was under there, and the whatever was under there was almost certainly one of the Keth scout forms, the low-profile burrowers they sent ahead of the main formation, designed to map terrain and neutralize advance elements before the primary mass arrived. She stood very still, controlled her breathing the way the combat instructor had taught her to control it. Not by slowing it down, which was a myth, but by keeping it even, keeping the blood oxygen steady, keeping the hands from doing the shaking thing hands did when adrenaline got hold of them. The ripple stopped. She did not move. 30 seconds. A minute. The heat was immense. The canteen water was calling to her from the side pocket. The sand erupted. It came up fast. 3 meters of sand-colored chitin and angular limbs. The scout form's sensory cluster rotating to fix on her with whatever passed for eyes in the Keth perceptual system. It was built low to the ground, compressed, 5 limbs in the locomotor cluster, and 2 in the manipulator cluster. And the manipulators were already moving in the pattern that preceded the acid spray organ's discharge. She shot it 4 times. Center mass, which was a vestigial concept from fighting things that had centers and masses in the conventional sense. But the Keth scout form had a primary ganglion cluster in its thorax, and 4 rounds through the thorax disrupted the ganglion cluster with enough reliability to call it a method. The scout form collapsed in sections, the locomotors still cycling weakly, the sensory cluster still rotating, still trying to fix on her, still trying to do its job. She watched it for a moment, breathing hard, the sidearm still raised. "I know," she said to it. "Me too." She didn't lower the sidearm until the locomotors stopped. Then she stepped around the twitching body and kept walking. 4.3 became 3.1. 3.1 became 2. The ridge to the west was doing what ridge did with the sun, eating it slowly, the shadow beginning its crawl across the valley floor. She calculated, moved faster, counted her breathing. The second scout form came from the right, faster than the first, and she was already turning when it hit her. She went down hard, the desert floor against her right shoulder, the canteen bouncing loose, the sidearm skidding 3 meters through the sand. The scout form's manipulators found her jacket, the chitin of them clicking against the reinforced collar. And she was aware in a very detached way that she was about to die by acid dissolution, which was one of the worst ways, and she had been trying to avoid the worst ways. She found the sidearm. 7 rounds left. No, 6, 'cause 1 misfired with her hand at this angle. She put the remaining 5 through the scout form's thorax at a range of roughly 40 centimeters, and it dropped on top of her. She lay under it for a moment, breathing, then she pushed it off. Then she lay in the sand and looked at the sky, which was doing the things skies did before dark, deepening from bone white to amber to the first tentative suggestion of purple. Stars would come. Out here in the flatlands, away from every human light source, the stars would come in enormous numbers. She had always liked the stars. Even now, especially now, she got up, found the canteen, drank half of what was left because she needed it, and the math on the remaining distance had changed. 1.4 kilometers. She could do 1.4 kilometers. The wrist unit pinged. Ben's signal, steady, southeast. She found southeast and walked toward it. She was thinking about the water, about the fact that she had used 5 rounds on the second scout and had 1 left, which was a number that meant essentially nothing in terms of combat utility, but was technically not 0, which she appreciated. She was thinking about the photograph in her left breast pocket, and whether she was going to need it before she reached the rendezvous, and she would decide she was not, because she was going to reach the rendezvous, because the alternative was the kind of thinking she did not do on active approach. She was thinking about all of this when she walked into the group. 30 meters, maybe less. They'd been below the thermal signature threshold. The briefings had recently noted the Keth primary forms could go cold when stationary, reduce their metabolic expression to near ambient, which was new, which was why the briefings kept changing. There were 11 of them. Primary assault forms, the tall ones, 2.5 meters, broad, the compound sensory array across what would have been a face filling with color shift as they detected her. The leader, the largest, turned its full sensory array toward her, and she saw the color pattern cycle through registration to threat assessment, to something she didn't have a term for, something that in a human face she might have called calculation. She stopped 1 round, 11 of them. "Okay," she said quietly, to herself, or to the photograph in her pocket, or to Ben at the rendezvous point 1.4 kilometers southeast, or to no one in particular. "Okay." The group leader stepped forward. It moved with the fluid certainty of something that had never had reason to doubt the outcome of a confrontation. In 30,000 years of expansion, why would it? Its manipulators opened in a pattern she recognized from the mission briefings, as a disarmament gesture, a command. Lay down the weapon, submit to processing, the war is over for you. She looked at the sidearm in her hand, 1 round. She looked at the group leader. She thought about Ben at the rendezvous point. She thought about the survey contract on Meridian, the flat rock shelf, the scanner in her hand, the silence before the follow-up burst. She thought about 11 minutes of not knowing, and then knowing, and how she had stood there with the sun on her face and decided she wasn't going to spend whatever time was left standing on rocks. She thought about 3 years of deciding that, every morning, before she even opened her eyes, just quietly deciding it again. She didn't point the sidearm at the group leader. She pointed it at the sand. She fired. The round detonated the burrowed ordnance she had already mapped with the wrist unit's seismic reader, which had been running since the first scout form went down. It was designed for geological surveys. It read vibration patterns, subsurface density, the signature of disrupted substrate. She had spent the last 3 years learning to read it for other things. 2 days ago, she'd told Ben about the burrowed ordnance cache she'd located under the forward Keth position during an ostensibly routine transit. And Ben had said what? And she'd said, "I'll explain it when I get there." The detonation was lateral. It went out, not up, which was what buried ordnance did when the earth above it had been softened by repeated burrowing, which the scout forms had accomplished on their circuits before she encountered them. The group leader caught the full force of it at a range of 8 meters. 5 of the remaining assault forms went down. The others scattered, their sensory arrays strobing in the pattern that indicated surprise, which the briefing said they didn't have, which the briefing said couldn't happen, which was why briefings kept changing. She was already running, not away southeast. The wrist unit showed 1.4 kilometers. Behind her, she could hear them. The harmonic frequency, the sound of reorganization, the particular percussion of Keth primary forms resuming pursuit configuration. They were fast. She knew they were fast. She had a head start of seconds, and the desert was flat and the light was going. She ran anyway. This was the thing about humans, and she couldn't explain it any better than Ben could, but she had always understood it in the way you understood things in your body, rather than your mind. You heard about the end of the world, and you signed up. You lay under a dead scout form on the burning sand, and you pushed it off. You stood in front of 11 combat forms with 1 round, and you thought about what the wrist unit had been reading. You did not stop. That was the whole of it. You found the reason not to stop, and you did not stop. 800 meters. The purple in the sky was darkening. The first stars. 600 meters, she could hear them. She did not look back, because looking back was the kind of thing that cost you fractions, and fractions were what you were running on. 400 meters. Ben's signal on the wrist unit, strong now, and below it, the signatures she hadn't told him about yet because she'd wanted to wait until she could see his face when she did. The 3 UDIF crawler units she'd mapped into the cache location 6 hours ago, disguised in Keth thermal signature. The ones she'd calculated that the group would walk between during their stationary cold suppression cycle. 200 meters and a voice. Stella, and a light. She didn't look at the light. She looked at the wrist unit. She keyed the trigger sequence she'd been compositing since the second scout form. The one built from the crawler ignition codes and the mapped coordinates and the calculations she'd been doing in her head for 6 hours while she walked through the desert wanting to get home. The horizon behind her went white. She ran the last 200 meters while it was still white. Ben caught her before she went down. One arm around her back, the other taking her weight, and she grabbed his jacket and stood there, her face against his shoulder, breathing, while the white behind her faded to orange, and then to the normal dark of a desert night. "You want to tell me," he said after a while, "what just happened?" "Burrowed ordnance cache," she said. "Keth Forward Depot. About 11,000 tons of tertiary incendiary rounds stored for the second wave push. They were sitting on top of it." He was quiet for a moment. "You walked through that whole desert knowing that was back there. I needed them to follow me to the right spot. You couldn't have mentioned that on comms. I was rationing the sips." He pulled back and looked at her face, doing the thing people did when they needed to establish that another person was real, present, alive in front of them. She looked back at him. "I'm fine," she said. "You have sand in places. I'm fine." He looked at her for another moment, then he nodded. She reached into her left breast pocket and took out the photograph. It was crinkled and soft with old sweat, the edges worn down to a consistency like cloth. She looked at it in the orange light of the fading detonation. 2 people she recognized and a coastline she had not seen in 7 years. The water behind them very blue. The kind of blue that water only was in certain latitudes at certain times of year. "Didn't need it," she said. She put it back. Ben got the canteen from the crawler and handed it to her without saying anything. She drank it. He watched the horizon, where the orange was settling into the deeper red of burned substrate, the Kethi Sipo continuing to feed itself as the incendiaries caught their neighbors, and the chain found its length. "How far does that go?" he asked. "About 4 kilometers in radius, maybe 5. They had a lot of the tertiary rounds. Second wave? Delayed. Maybe a week, maybe more. Depends on what they have in reserve further north." She handed the canteen back. "I have coordinates on 2 more cache sites. Map them on the way in." He looked at her. "On the way in," he said, "while you were trying to get home." "It's the same direction, yes," she laughed. It was a real laugh, a short one. The kind that came out when something was too absurd to respond to otherwise. She'd always liked that laugh. She'd been looking forward to hearing it again. "Come on," he said. "Let's get inside before the temperature drops." They went inside. The crawler was cramped and smelled of recycled air, and the particular institutional staleness of military equipment had been running too long. and she settled into the forward seat and let the warmth of it get into her bones while Ben ran the check sequence. And the crawler systems responded with their familiar low hum. Outside, the desert was doing what deserts did at night. Cooling fast, releasing the stored heat of the day back into the sky in long invisible waves. The stars were coming in full force now. Extraordinary numbers of them, the kind of star sky you only saw in places with no human light to blunt it. She watched them through the crawler's forward screen. Same stars. They'd been there before the Keth arrived, and they would be there after, and in the meantime they were hers as much as anyone's. As much as the survey ridge on Meridian, and the photograph in her pocket, and the 2 more cache locations loaded in the wrist unit. The harmonic frequency was gone. The desert had stopped holding its breath. "Stella," Ben said, not looking up from the check sequence. "Yeah, I'm glad you got home." She watched the stars for another moment. The orange on the horizon had faded completely now. The night was clean and very dark and full of light. "Me too," she said.